The compact MPV space is actually a segment that a lot of car makers have abandoned. Kia hasn't had the Karens in Malaysia for a long time. Honda completely axed the BRV, which means that now you only really have the Perodua Alza and the Toyota Veloz, as well as the Mitsubishi Xpander if you don't really give a hoot about safety. And that may explain why the BYD M6 is as popular as it is, because not only did this car collect 1,000 bookings within the first month of launch, this has actually turned out to be BYD SIAM's best-selling model for the month of November. So, because we were very intrigued, we asked to borrow one for a week to figure out if this is the compact MPV that everyone's been missing, or if everybody's lost their minds. My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the BYD M6. Now, the BYD M6 is available in Malaysia in two variants, the standard and the extended. We've got the extended here. The difference between the two is in terms of battery and overall performance. So for the standard model, you get a 55 kilowatt-hour LFP battery, good to provide at any DC range of about 400-ish kilometers, although realistically, it's more like 350. And then with that car, DC charging is rated at 88 kilowatts, whereas with the extended model, you get a 71 kilowatt-hour battery, which provides an NEDC range of north of 500 kilometers, although realistically, again, you're looking at about 450. However, with the extended model, in addition to the additional range, you also get an improvement in DC charging speed because this car will charge at up to 115 kilowatts, although AC charging remains identical between both models at 7 kilowatts AC. In terms of the design, it's quite clear that the BYD M6 shares a lot with the Atto 3. So for example, you get this blade that goes from one end all the way to the other, housing the BYD logo up here. You get a set of slim, wide LED headlights, replete with LED indicators, as well as this very unique sort of downturned dog bone style design down here, which again reminds me a lot of the BYD Atto 3. This is not an Ocean series car, which is why the design language more similarly or more closely resembles what we've seen from the Atto 3. What is worth pointing out, however, is that because this is an electric car, there is no need for a grille, which is why the nose of this car comes down quite low. The only opening for air is actually down here in order to help cool the radiators, as well as down here in order to improve the aerodynamic efficiency of the car, up here, to improve the aerodynamic efficiency of the car in order to improve airflow over the front wheels in order to reduce drag. Now, from the front end, I do actually think the BYD M6 looks quite handsome, even though this is a compact or maybe mid-size MPV, because dimensionally this is more similar to a Toyota Innova rather than in Avanza or a Veloz. It is quite handsome for an MPV at least. And that same sense of handsomeness actually extends to the side profile, where I think that this car actually strikes a pretty good balance between the need for space without compromising too much. Now, rolling stock are handled by a set of GT Control P10 tires wrapped around 17-inch alloy wheels. It is worth pointing out that these wheels are not aerodynamically designed, and so I appreciate the fact they look like wheels. As we move further down the side, there are chrome trims set above and below the window, but this, I think, I find quite offensive because back here there's a little bump where it says space. I know it's a 7-seater, I didn't need to be informed of that. And that same sense of maturity again extends to the rear, where you have this full-width piece of chrome, which I think really does help to break up the slab-sided, or rather the large amount of metalwork back here. And you also have a set of very good-looking, to me at least, slim taillights, replete with an LED light bar that goes all the way across. And as far as I'm concerned, I do think the back end of this car does look quite good. Even the piece of chrome down there just looks quite tasteful, I think, which is interesting to say of a BYD, let alone a Chinese car. Now, behind the tailgate, with the third row up, you'll notice a couple of things. Firstly, the tailgate is incredibly noisy. And secondly, with the third row up, there really isn't that much space in here, even though this is an Innova, or more like an Innova-sized vehicle. With the third row up and the backrest set completely 90 degrees upright, there is barely enough space even for this backpack. If you wanted this to be at a more reasonable human level, you might need to pull it back like that, and then you have even less space, at least vertically. Now, of course, most people who buy cars like these actually use them as two-row vehicles, which means that the third row is largely flattened. And when so done, or when so specified, you'll realize that there is a huge amount of space back here. This is easily larger than a BYD Dolphin obviously, and also larger than a BYD Atto 3, which means that if you are looking for a more practical, sort of compact-ish EV to drive about in town, this might be a good solution for you. And because this car is electric, with the electric motor mounted at the front, there is actually space underneath the boot floor. It isn't a huge amount of space, I will admit, but it is at least large enough to hold the 3-pin plug as well as the various emergency requirements as needed in this car, like an emergency inflator kit, as well as your towing eye, etc. And all of that lives quite neatly down here. It is worth pointing out, however, that this box, this sort of plastic box that lives underneath the boot floor, is actually screwed into the car, which means there is no option for you to remove this and just make full use of the space. I have a feeling that it's because there are some structural members underneath this plastic which they're trying to hide, but at least, again, the space is usable enough for the stuff that you need, and that keeps it nicely tucked away and out of sight. Now, if you're wondering why we haven't put the charging cables in the front, that's because there is actually no space in the front. Now, if you open the bonnet, you will realize that there is actually a little bit of a dip, which means that theoretically, you could put a box in there and then put stuff in that box. But we would advise against that, because a lot of the boxes that you find to fit to the front of these cars, usually on Taobao and stuff like that, are not actually tested with these cars, at least not at the speeds that we drive. Which means that if you were to put a box in there, that might actually create enough lift within the area between the two front wheels that might result in something quite nasty, like pushing the bonnet up when you don't want it to. Now, in terms of the interior, we've got the BYD M6 Extended, which means that we get a few more goodies in here than you would over the Standard. So that starts actually with the seats. Now, although the seat design is the same, the upholstery is a little bit different, because for the Extended, we actually get this faux leather material replete with perforations in order to aid the ventilation function that you get as standard in the higher end model. You also get the panoramic sunroof in this car, which I think looks fantastic, and overall this interior is quite pleasant. Now, the seats themselves are quite comfortable. The material quality down here is quite nice, replete with stitching. The same goes for the doors and the armrest specifically, but when you start looking about the place, you will find some hard, scratchy plastic dotted about certain areas. So up here, for example, this is all hard and scratchy. The tops of the dash is also hard and scratchy, but then the top of the doors is soft again. Down here is also quite soft, and so BYD has really thought about where you might actually make contact with the car itself and prioritize using higher end materials in those areas rather than places that you won't touch, like the top of the dash. Let's be honest, you only touch this in the showroom, you're not going to touch it while you're driving or when you actually own the damn car. Now, beyond that, we get a wireless phone charger on one side as well as a phone holder on the other. You get more buttons down here, a couple of cup holders, a little cubby hole here, which is big enough to hold even, well, most size phones. Mine's just oversized. And then you actually have a decently sized center armrest here, at least big enough to hold cards or a notepad or something like that, as well as a USB-C, USB-A port, and your 12-volt socket. That's all down here. Your glove box in this car is also quite large, which is certainly very good given the fact this is an MPV, which means that families usually have a lot more stuff, and so you need to hide a lot more of that stuff. And so you've got more space here. You've got decently sized door bins, big enough for a 1.5 litre size bottle, as well as more space behind that. There's even a little cubby hole down here, which I think should be just about large enough to hold one of the newer smart tags. And so that's all very good. Now, in terms of technology, while you do have this large central touchscreen which can be rotated, a BYD favorite, and it's got the same user interface that we've seen from other BYD models, and it's very snappy, very responsive, all well and good. Unfortunately, all the HVAC controls also live in here. However, BYD has been quite smart in terms of the user interface, because no matter which screen you're on, which includes wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, you can always slide from the bottom to reveal your HVAC controls. This is especially good when you're trying to adjust the temperature or trying to switch the ventilation on and off on your seat. However, this is the only screen in the car because there is no heads-up display, and more importantly, the instrument cluster are actually a pair of analog dials with a small digital screen in the middle, which is very similar to what we've seen from, say, older Toyotas. Now, I will point out the fact that the BYD M6 is actually an entry-level vehicle, because this car has been adapted from the BYD E6, which is an even more basic, even more bare-bones version of this car. And I suppose sticking a digital instrument cluster in here would have been a bit too costly, or perhaps this car was never even designed for one, which is why even in the higher end model that we have here, it's still analog dials. Now, despite that, I will point out the fact the analog dials are very easy to read, they're very legible, and they remain quite bright even when the lights are off, because it's an Optitron type meter. But the screen in the middle being as small as it is, has to pack a lot of information in a very small amount of space. This is not too dissimilar to what we've seen before from the BYD Atto 3 and the BYD Dolphin, where they had that very small instrument cluster display. And so it can be a little bit confusing to try and figure out what information is where on that screen, because there's a lot going on. That said, however, because there is a digital screen in there, at least that allows for a readout for this car's ADAS functionalities, because as with any BYD, this car comes chock full with level 2 semi-autonomy features. Now, beyond that, you will find some other things in here that may not be so great. So for example, while you have a couple of cup holders here, they're not the largest items in the world, which means larger bottles or larger cups are going to struggle to fit in here. And even though this car has an electronic gear selector, there is no space underneath the center console, which I think is fine because the center console is quite low to begin with, but that might be something that you might have gotten used to if you've had other EVs before. And while there is a very nice sunglasses holder here, which is not something that you find very often in cars now, I find, I will point out the fact that even though we have a panoramic sunroof with an electric sunblind, proving that BYD can indeed do this and they're just shortchanging you on the BYD seal, the blind itself is incredibly noisy in operation, a lot like that powered tailgate. Now, in the back of the BYD M6, again, life is pretty pleasant because with the front seats that are in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, you can see I have a huge amount of knee room and a pretty decent amount of headroom. Again, despite the standard fit panoramic sunroof with the electric sunblind, proving that, again, you can have one of those, BYD. Now, I will point out that these seats are currently set up in their furthest rearward position, which is maximizing space in the second row. But even if you were to move this to a more reasonable level to make space for the people behind you, there's still a good amount of room in here. Now, on that note, you do get air conditioning controls, at least in terms of the blower speed, and the air conditioning vents live up on the roof, which means that you can actually get quite comfortable in here without too much issue. There is a USB-C and USB-A port down there. There is a deployable center armrest, which makes space for a third center passenger, although I will point out that even though the floor is flat, this seat base is quite narrow, which means that if you were to be sat in here, you wouldn't want to be sat here for very long. On top of that, these rear seats can also recline quite a bit. So if you want to lean back like this, you can do that, or you can sit more upright should you so want to, although the seat is being a little bit recalcitrant at the moment. So for example, if you are a masochist and you like sitting at a 90-degree angle, you can do that too. Now, I'm sure that the eagle-eyed amongst you may have pointed out or may have already noticed the fact that even when I'm stretched out like this, I don't really have that much in terms of under-thigh support. These seat bases, I think, have been artificially shortened in order to provide the illusion of space in the second row, but because the front seats are actually mounted a little bit higher, it does mean that stretching out isn't too much of an issue. There isn't that much obstruction underneath the front seat either, which means that sat like this, I am decently comfortable. On top of that, because I'm sat here, I could enjoy this enormous window, which I think would be great for children, mounted in the two ISOFIX mounts on the two outer seats, so they have a great view out. And as an adult, even though this is not a particularly large car, because of the light-colored headlining as well as the panoramic sunroof, I just have an excellent view out and it feels nice and airy and spacious. Now, with this seat set up like this, I actually have a pretty decent amount of space. My knee room is about 2 fingers wide, and I've got about that much headroom, which means that, again, as a 170 centimeter adult, I can actually sit in this third row pretty well. And because the front seats are, again, set up a little bit higher than you might expect, I can actually tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, which allows me to sit a little bit more comfortably. This backrest recline angle can also be adjusted, which means that I can get a little bit more comfortable. And when I do that, the seat base actually protrudes a little bit more, which means that, again, you do have a decent amount of comfort back here. Now, to that end, I will point out a couple of things. Firstly, there are cup holders here, which are big enough for a large size bottle, which is nice. I do have my own air conditioning vents back here, which means life is quite comfortable. However, I will point out the fact that it would have been nice to have USB ports, because I think that's the only thing that this car is really lacking for third row passengers, which means that if you do have younger children sat back here with their devices and so on, they might get bored after a while. And now, as an adult, I wouldn't want to be sat back here for more than, say, a couple of hours, because while this seat is actually surprisingly comfortable, because my legs don't really have a lot of space to stretch downwards, I don't have any under thigh support, which means that eventually my thighs are going to start hurting. But that said, these third row seats are decently wide, which means I'm not going to be fighting for room with the guy sat next to me. So this is actually pretty usable. And while I'm back here, I'd also like to point out the fact that even though this car is more practical than the BYD Atto 3 or the BYD Dolphin, unfortunately there is no tonneau cover, which means that if you have the third row folded down for more luggage space, you can't hide it. So bear that in mind if you have any valuables in the back of your BYD M6, or if you're considering this in order to carry valuables, I suppose. Now, the BYD M6 is worth bearing in mind is a vehicle in a segment that a lot of car makers have abandoned. And so while Toyota and Mitsubishi make a lot of noise about how well their cars drive, the BYD M6, well, Now, the thing about the BYD M6 is that a lot like the BYD Atto 3, this is not an Ocean Series vehicle. And as a result, the way this car is engineered and manufactured is a little bit different. And so the priorities are also a little bit different from what we've seen, again, from Ocean Series vehicles. So barring the Dolphin, for example, the Seal and the Sea Lion are both vehicles that BYD have very clearly engineered in order to sort of accommodate the mass luxury market, the sort of entry-level premium space, which is why the Seal and the Sea Lion are both incredibly quiet, incredibly refined, and in the case of the SUV, unnervingly comfortable. This M6, however, is not quite like that. Now, for those of you who may not be aware, the BYD M6 is actually a more high-end version of the BYD E6. Now, the E6 is meant to be sort of an entry-level compact MPV sort of affair, something that would more traditionally go up against things like the Toyota Innova or the Avanza, actually, for that matter, as well as the Toyota Veloz. But in M6, guys, it is a little bit more upmarket. That's why we have the better materials in this car, for example, slightly improved performance, the bigger battery, etc. But despite that, there is a very clear focus on value. So for example, some of the things that I've noticed in this car, the windows on this car are not sort of dual laminate glass or dual pane glass as we've seen from other BYD models. And I'm pretty sure that also extends to the windscreen, because for the life of me, I can't get anyone to confirm or in fact deny that the windscreen is just a single piece of glass instead of a two-piece laminate affair. And then there is also the matter of the wheels. Now, of course, the rolling stock for this car might not be particularly exciting in terms of size or design, but ultimately it is functional and they're meant to be durable, apparently. And so that seems to be the focus of this vehicle. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that is perfectly acceptable for what it is. The M6 is a compact MPV, even though it's not that small. And so the focus here is in order to deliver value, to deliver comfort, and to deliver safety. And I think that to that end, this car does extremely well. So firstly, let's touch on the performance. So this car does about 201 horsepower, or 201 PS, and 310 Newton meters of torque, which makes it identical to the Atto 3, as well as the top-end BYD Dolphin. Now, while that might not set your heart on fire, at least not if you've been paying attention to things like the BYD Seal and Sea Lion, as well as the MG Cyberster or the MG4 X-Power, I can confirm to you that this is actually more than enough power than you'll ever need, particularly, again, in a vehicle like this. Vehicles like these are primarily used by people to just, go to the shops or go send the kids to school and then go to work and that sort of thing. And for that purpose, I think that this powertrain is plenty powerful enough. On top of that, because it still has 310 Newton meters of torque, which is most certainly not to be scoffed at, it does mean that when you do need to get this car up to speed, it gets there pretty urgently. Which means that, for example, joining motorways, for example, there's absolutely no issue at all. However, vehicles like these are also used by families who like to take in a few adventures. And on that note, there are some things that I'd like to point out. In terms of the ride and handling of this car, when you're driving it about at urban speeds, the BYD M6 is fine. This car is very comfortable. You feel relatively isolated from the lumps and bumps around you. And where I live, where the roads are particularly crap, this car does quite well. And because of its relatively long wheelbase, it does permit the car to settle down pretty quickly after hitting a speed bump, so that's certainly nice to see. However, because this is geared as a family car, that means that there's been a certain emphasis on comfort over dynamics. Now, of course, any of you who are buying a compact MPV or any 7-seater for that matter, thinking of dynamics are probably insane. But if that is your thing for whatever reason, then the BYD M6 is not for you, because this car does suffer from a pretty pronounced degree of body lean, particularly due to the fact that this car is quite heavy. And then when you add to that it has very thick tires and very relatively small alloy wheels, it does mean there is quite a bit of sidewall flex when you are pushing on a bit. Although again, you shouldn't really be pushing on because this is a family car. Now, that aside, if you're just trying to cruise, then this car presents another set of problems. So cruising in a straight line is perfectly comfortable, perfectly decent, and from the driver's seat, the steering wheel actually feels pretty communicative, so you always know what the car is doing. The trouble comes in terms of refinement, because unfortunately, while other BYD products have impressed hugely, especially with high-speed refinement, the BYD M6 is not that great. Once you hit about 100 kilometers an hour thereabouts, you get very pronounced wind noise coming from the A-pillar. And that noise just gets worse when you start to hit, 110, 120 kilometers an hour, the typical cruising speed for Malaysian motorways. And then there comes a matter of road noise. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this car runs on GT tires, or GT, however the hell it is that you pronounce it, and they're not that great in terms of road noise suppression. So, for example, they're very surface dependent. So if you're on a nice road, they're decently quiet, but if you're on a crap road, then it gets a little bit loud. But I can, however, confirm that at least overall performance of the tires themselves are pretty commendable, both in the dry and in the wet. At no point has this car left me scrabbling, so that's certainly very admirable. However, if I were an owner, I would probably want to upgrade these tires to something a little bit more high-end, particularly with something with slightly better road noise suppression, in order to ensure that this experience remains a little bit more serene. However, if you are going to cruise that long, then there comes the nature of the range. Now, this car has a claimed range of about 420, 450 kilometers thereabouts on a full charge, and I can verify that that is indeed a number that you can expect to hit. With our testing, we've discovered the BYD M6 does anywhere between 17 to 19 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, depending on the kind of driving you're doing, and more importantly, how many opportunities there are for the car to regenerate power as it slows down. Regen plays a very important role in average power efficiency in an EV, and so if you're just driving on the motorway, open road, no real slowing down, just a maintain, sustain cruise the whole time, then you will find that the power consumption goes up quite a bit. But when you're driving about in town, it is very easy to achieve even 16 kilowatt hours to the 100, and so specified, you should be able to do well over 400 kilometers on a charge, which means that KL to Penang, for example, will not be an issue at all. And then, because this car runs on an LFP battery, it means that whenever it is that you arrive at your destination, be it a hotel or an apartment or a holiday home, you can plug your car in and charge it up to full and then make full use of that range. This is also especially noteworthy for those of you who might be considering one of these and you live in an urban dwelling like a condo, like me, where you cannot charge at home. Because then if you're relying on a DC public charger, you will want to maximize your charge every time you go. And so charging this to 100% is not an issue at all. Now, from charging, I actually want to go into safety because these two things are actually related. When I drove the MG ZS, I realized that if you use the adaptive cruise control, when the car slows down, it doesn't regenerate any power, which means that it ended up being quite thirsty on battery electrons when driving through traffic, because that's usually when I use adaptive cruise control. However, for this M6, the adaptive cruise control is smart enough that when it does slow down, it will do so in a way that regenerates power. And so you are recouping some electrons into the battery, making this an overall more efficient experience. And the adaptive cruise control is just one of a myriad of safety features within this car, which give it level 2 semi-autonomy. This means that the car can basically drive itself through traffic, although obviously with your hands on the wheel and your eyes ahead of you. But that given, the car runs just fine. It's a very dependable ADAS system. And this is, of course, on top of things like autonomous emergency braking with pedestrian detection, 360-degree camera, which in this car is fantastic, as well as an around view monitor, rear cross traffic alert, blind spot monitoring, all the things that you would come to expect from a new and also electric vehicle. So what that means to me is that even though I am not an MPV buyer, this car is squarely aimed at people who are not me. But despite that, I do understand why this car is so incredibly popular. Firstly, you don't really have that many options in the space anymore because you're largely limited to just the Perodua, Alza, the Toyota Veloz and the Mitsubishi Xpander. Because Kia or Hyundai, neither of them have anything else to offer. Honda's abandoned the space, which means this is basically all you've got if you want something that's a bit more upmarket. And then when you add to that the fact that this is a really well-engineered vehicle, a very well-specified vehicle at that, it just makes a lot of sense. If I had a couple of kids or more, then yeah, the M6 would probably be an MPV that I would consider for myself because the specifications in here are just bang on. You have refinement, you've got comfort, you have safety, and when the mood takes you, actually have a little bit of performance. You don't have that much in terms of drivability, but again, that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, this is a car that needs to do very, very well at being a family shuttle. And I think that as a family shuttle, you don't really get much better than this. However, if you want something that is slightly more affordable and more importantly, more able to accommodate your long distance trips, so that is something that you do with your family very often, then you may be better served by the Toyota Veloz, which unfortunately suffers from broadly the same problems as this, like in terms of NVH and drivability, but at least that car is petrol powered and comes with an unlimited mileage warranty. And of course, if you want something that is more accommodating as a whole, then consider the Kia Carnival, which not only is a larger car, which means there is not only more space for people, but also more space for their things, but it even comes with a current promotion where you can even get 5 years of subsidized diesel, which means you end up paying less than pump prices for the duration of the warranty, which is certainly very, very good. That means that the lack of diesel subsidy is not something that should concern you at all. And plus, the fact that car can do 1100 kilometers on a single tank quite easily at that means that you're not really thinking about it all that much. But all told, if you're looking for a compact MPV to do work in town primarily, just to cart the kids around, get them to school, to do family, very domestic kind of errands and that sort of thing, you really cannot go wrong with a BYD M6. I've yet to find a single thing about this car that I find truly irritating. Something that would cause me to completely forget about this car and not recommend it to anyone who might be interested. This is an excellent car. And it also helps that it's decently good looking with a good warranty. In any case, that concludes our review of the BYD M6 extended range. If you enjoyed this video, please give this a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.